Karoline Leavitt sat on the hard wooden bench in the courtroom, her hands gripping the edges of her purse tightly. Her heart was racing, and she couldn't help but glance nervously at her husband, Daniel, who stood beside her. He looked calm, almost too calm, given the situation they were in. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie not perfectly straight, and his shoes had a faint scuff mark on the toe. To anyone else, he might have looked like an ordinary man, someone who didn't belong in a formal setting like this. But Karoline knew better. She trusted him completely, even if the world around them seemed ready to doubt him. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of papers shuffling and the occasional cough from someone in the gallery. The air felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of judgment that was about to be passed down. Across the aisle, their neighbor, Mr. Peterson, sat with his lawyer, looking smug and confident. This was a minor property dispute, really, a disagreement over where one yard ended and another began, but it had escalated into something much bigger. For weeks now, tensions between the two families had been simmering, and today was the day everything would come to a head. Judge Harold Grayson entered the room, his black robe flowing behind him as he walked briskly to his seat. He adjusted his glasses and scanned the room with a piercing gaze that made everyone sit up a little straighter. Known for his sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude, Judge Grayson wasn't the kind of person you wanted to cross. His reputation preceded him, and there were whispers among the townsfolk about how intimidating he could be in court. Karoline swallowed hard when she saw the stern look on his face. She hoped Daniel knew what he was doing. "Good morning," Judge Grayson said, his voice deep and commanding. "Let's get started, counselor. Please present your case." The lawyer for Mr. Peterson stood up immediately, smoothing out his expensive-looking suit before addressing the judge. He spoke confidently, explaining how the Leavitts had allegedly encroached on their neighbor's land by building a small shed near the property line. According to him, this was a clear violation of boundaries, and he argued that the shed should be removed at once. As he spoke, he gestured dramatically toward diagrams and maps that had been prepared as evidence. It all sounded very convincing, and Karoline felt her stomach churn with anxiety. When it was finally Daniel's turn to speak, he stepped forward slowly, his hands still tucked into the pockets of his suit jacket. He didn't have a fancy legal team or glossy presentations to back him up. All he had were his words and the facts he had painstakingly gathered during countless hours of research. But standing there under the harsh lights of the courtroom, he suddenly felt very exposed. The eyes of everyone in the room were on him, waiting to see what he would say. Judge Grayson leaned forward slightly, studying Daniel with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. After a moment, he spoke. "Mr. Leavitt, is it? You're representing yourself here today?" His tone was polite enough, but there was an edge to it, a hint of mockery lurking just beneath the surface. "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside him. "Well then," Judge Grayson continued, leaning back in his chair with a smirk, "I hope you've brushed up on your legal knowledge, because based on your appearance, I'd say you're more likely to excel at fixing cars than navigating the intricacies of property law." A ripple of laughter spread through the gallery, and Karoline felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She glanced at Daniel, expecting to see anger or frustration in his expression, but instead he simply nodded politely, keeping his composure intact. There was no trace of defensiveness in his demeanor, only quiet determination. "I assure you, Your Honor," Daniel said after a pause, "I've done my homework." Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Oh, really? Then perhaps you can enlighten us. What exactly do you think gives you the right to build on someone else's property?" Daniel took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "With respect, Your Honor, the land in question has been part of our family's property for generations. We have documentation dating back 50 years that proves the boundary lines are accurate. If anything, it's Mr. Peterson who's mistaken about where his property ends." This statement caught the judge off guard. He frowned, leaning forward again, his interest piqued. "Documentation, you say? Let's see it." Without hesitation, Daniel reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder containing old maps, deeds, and letters exchanged between previous owners of the properties. He laid them out neatly on the table in front of the judge, pointing to specific sections as he explained their significance. Each document told a story, painting a picture of a long-standing misunderstanding that had only recently come to light. As Daniel spoke, Judge Grayson's expression shifted ever so slightly. The initial mockery faded, replaced by something closer to curiosity. He flipped through the pages, nodding occasionally as he absorbed the information. Meanwhile, Mr. Peterson's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unprepared for this level of detail. Karoline watched her husband with a mix of awe and relief. She had always known Daniel was intelligent, but seeing him hold his own against seasoned professionals was something else entirely. He wasn't flashy or overly dramatic. Instead, he relied on logic and clarity, presenting his case in a way that was impossible to ignore. By the time Daniel finished speaking, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. The earlier jokes and snickers had died down, replaced by murmurs of admiration. Even Judge Grayson seemed impressed, though he did his best to hide it. He cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses before addressing Daniel once more. "Mr. Leavitt," he said, his tone noticeably softer this time, "you may not dress like a lawyer, but you certainly argue like one. I'll need some time to review these documents before making a decision, but I must admit, you've given me plenty to think about." With that, the session adjourned, leaving the Leavitts and everyone else in the room buzzing with anticipation. Karoline turned to Daniel, her eyes shining with pride. "You were amazing," she whispered, squeezing his hand tightly. Daniel smiled faintly, shrugging off the compliment. "We're not done yet," he reminded her, "but we've got a good chance." And for the first time since the dispute began, Karoline allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they might actually win. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the judge announced a short recess. People filed out into the hallway, some stretching their legs, others whispering excitedly about what they had just witnessed. Karoline stayed seated, her mind racing with thoughts of hope and doubt. She glanced at Daniel, who was calmly organizing the papers he had presented earlier. His hands moved steadily, as though nothing unusual had happened. To anyone watching, he might have seemed indifferent, but Karoline knew better. Beneath his calm exterior, Daniel was strategizing, thinking ahead to the next steps. Outside, Mr. Peterson paced back and forth, his face red with frustration. He muttered under his breath to his lawyer, who looked equally uneasy. The documents Daniel had produced were unexpected, and it was clear they hadn't prepared for this kind of challenge. For weeks, they had assumed the Leavitts would be easy to intimidate. After all, Daniel didn't have a law degree, and Karoline rarely spoke up in public. But now their confidence was shaken. When the session resumed, Judge Grayson returned to his seat, his expression unreadable. He called both parties back to order and turned his attention to Mr. Peterson's lawyer. "Counselor," he said firmly, "do you have anything further to add regarding the documents Mr. Leavitt has presented?" The lawyer hesitated, flipping through his notes nervously. "Your Honor," he began, clearing his throat, "we acknowledge the existence of these records, but their relevance is questionable. Property laws have evolved significantly over the years, and older deeds may not hold the same weight today." Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a bold claim. Are you suggesting that historical documentation carries no value in determining property boundaries?" The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "Not entirely, Your Honor. However, we must consider modern zoning regulations and recent surveys conducted by licensed professionals. These factors should take precedence over outdated records." Daniel listened intently, his jaw tightening slightly. When it was his turn to speak again, he stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "If I may, Your Honor," he began, addressing the judge directly. "The documents I've provided are not just random pieces of paper. They include official deeds signed by previous owners, maps approved by local authorities, and correspondence confirming the agreed-upon boundary lines. If modern surveys contradict these records, then perhaps the issue lies with the survey itself, not the documents." The room fell silent as Daniel continued. Furthermore, he added, pointing to one of the maps, this map clearly shows the exact location where the shed was built. It falls well within our property line according to every record available. Unless there's concrete evidence proving otherwise, I fail to see how my family can be accused of encroachment. Mr. Peterson's lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Grayson held up a hand to stop him. Enough, he said sharply. I've heard enough from both sides for now. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk thoughtfully. Mr. Leavitt, I'm curious. Where did you acquire all this information? Did you hire a legal consultant or conduct your own research? Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. I did most of the research myself, Your Honor. I spent hours at the county archives, going through old records and cross-referencing them with current laws. It wasn't easy, but I figured if I wanted to protect my family's home, I needed to understand the facts inside and out. A murmur of surprise rippled through the gallery. Even Judge Grayson looked taken aback. Impressive, he admitted, nodding, slowly. Very few people have the patience or the skill to do what you've done here today. Karoline couldn't help but smile at the compliment. She knew how hard Daniel had worked to prepare for this day. Late nights poring over dusty books, countless phone calls to government offices, and endless discussions with neighbors who remembered the history of the area. All of it had paid off in ways she hadn't dared to imagine. But Mr. Peterson wasn't ready to give up yet. As the hearing continued, his lawyer tried to poke holes in Daniel's arguments, raising technicalities and questioning the validity of certain documents. Each time, Daniel countered with clarity and precision, citing specific laws and precedents that supported his claims. By the end of the session, it was clear that the tide was turning in favor of the Leavitts. As the judge prepared to deliver his ruling, the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear the outcome. Judge Grayson adjusted his glasses one final time before speaking. After reviewing the evidence presented today, I find that the Leavitts have established a strong case based on historical documentation and legal precedent. While Mr. Peterson raises valid concerns about modern regulations, these do not override the clear and consistent records supporting the Leavitts' claim to the disputed land. Therefore, I rule in favor of the defendants. The words hit like a thunderclap. Karoline gasped, covering her mouth with her hand as tears welled up in her eyes. Daniel exhaled deeply, allowing himself a small smile of relief. Across the aisle, Mr. Peterson slumped in his seat, defeated while his lawyer packed up his briefcase in silence. Once the initial shock wore off, the gallery erupted into applause. Strangers congratulated Daniel on his victory, shaking his hand and patting him on the back. Reporters swarmed around him, asking for interviews and snapping photos. But Daniel remained humble, deflecting praise and insisting he had only done what any person would do to protect their home. Later that evening, as the couple sat together on their front porch, Karoline turned to Daniel with a look of admiration. I still can't believe you pulled it off, she said softly. You were incredible in there. Daniel chuckled, leaning back in his chair. It wasn't easy, he admitted. There were times when I doubted myself, but I knew we were in the right. And that gave me the strength to keep going. Karoline nodded, reaching over to squeeze his hand. You proved everyone wrong today, not just Mr. Peterson, but even the judge at first. No one expected you to know so much about the law. Well, Daniel replied with a shrug. Maybe they'll think twice before underestimating someone because of how they look or where they come from. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. For the first time in months, the Leavitts felt a sense of peace. Their home was safe, their dignity intact, and their faith in justice restored. And though Daniel's moment in the spotlight would eventually fade, the impact of his quiet brilliance would linger, for his family, his community, and perhaps even for Judge Grayson, who had learned an important lesson about appearances and assumptions. The days following the courtroom victory passed quickly for Daniel and Karoline Leavitt. Life in their small town began to settle back into its usual rhythm, but whispers of Daniel's unexpected triumph continued to ripple through the community. Neighbors who had once nodded politely in passing now stopped by the Leavitt home to congratulate them. Some brought casseroles or fresh-baked pies as gestures of goodwill, while others simply wanted to shake Daniel's hand and hear the story firsthand. At first, Daniel tried to downplay his role in the case. "I just did my homework," he'd say with a modest smile whenever someone praised him. But the more people heard about how he had outsmarted seasoned lawyers and won over Judge Grayson, the more they insisted on calling him a hero. Even the local newspaper ran a feature article titled, "Underdog Wins Big: How Daniel Leavitt Beat the Odds." A black and white photo of Daniel standing outside the courthouse accompanied the piece, his expression calm and unassuming. Karoline couldn't help but feel proud as she read the article aloud one evening. "Listen to this," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "Daniel Leavitt, a self-taught legal expert, proved that determination and knowledge can overcome even the toughest challenges. Doesn't that sound amazing?" Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Self-taught legal expert? That's stretching it a bit, don't you think?" He took a sip of coffee, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm no expert. I just knew what was at stake and worked hard to make sure we didn't lose." But Karoline wasn't buying his humility. "You're being too modest," she said firmly. "Not everyone would have taken the time to dig through old records and learn all those laws. You deserve every bit of credit you're getting." Despite his protests, Daniel found himself becoming something of a local celebrity. People started approaching him for advice on everything from property disputes to contract negotiations. At first, he turned most of them away, insisting he wasn't qualified to offer legal guidance. But when Mrs. Harper, an elderly widow whose landlord was threatening eviction, came knocking at their door, Daniel couldn't say no. He spent hours reviewing her lease agreement, pointing out clauses that protected her rights as a tenant. Armed with Daniel's notes, Mrs. Harper returned to her landlord and successfully negotiated a fair deal. Word of her victory spread quickly, and soon others followed suit, seeking Daniel's help with their own problems. Though he never charged a dime, Daniel found satisfaction in knowing he could make a difference. Meanwhile, Mr. Peterson and his family kept mostly to themselves after the trial. They avoided eye contact with the Leavitts whenever they crossed paths, and their once pristine yard began to show signs of neglect. It was clear the loss had bruised their pride, but Daniel made a point of not gloating. Instead, he extended an olive branch, inviting them over for coffee one Saturday morning. To everyone's surprise, Mr. Peterson accepted. The meeting was awkward at first, with both men exchanging polite but strained pleasantries. However, as they sat on the porch sipping coffee, Daniel broke the ice by talking about neutral topics like gardening and weather. Slowly, the tension eased, and by the end of the visit they parted ways with a mutual understanding. While they weren't exactly friends, the hostility between them had softened considerably. Back at home, Karoline marveled at her husband's ability to rise above pettiness. "Most people wouldn't have been so gracious after what they put us through," she said later that evening. "You really are something special, you know that?" Daniel shrugged, brushing off the compliment. "Holding on to anger doesn't do anyone any good," he replied. "Besides, life's too short to waste it being bitter." As weeks turned into months, the novelty of Daniel's courtroom win began to fade for most people. The reporters stopped calling, the neighbors stopped dropping by unannounced, and life returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could get. Yet the impact of that day lingered in subtle ways. For one, Daniel had developed a newfound confidence in himself. He no longer doubted his ability to tackle complex problems, whether they involved property lines or broken appliances in his garage. For Karoline, the experience had deepened her appreciation for her husband. She had always known he was smart and resourceful, but seeing him stand up against overwhelming odds had revealed a side of him she hadn't fully understood before. It wasn't just his intelligence that impressed her. It was his resilience, his patience, and his unwavering commitment to doing what was right. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Daniel tinkered with an old lawnmower in the driveway, a letter arrived. In the mail. Curious, Karoline opened it and scanned the contents before handing it to him. "You might want to read this," she said, her tone betraying a mix of excitement and disbelief. Daniel wiped his greasy hands on a rag and unfolded the letter. It was from a prestigious law school several states away, offering him a full scholarship, based on his demonstrated expertise in property law. According to the letter, someone who had attended the trial had recommended him to the admissions board, citing his remarkable performance in court as evidence of his potential. Karoline watched her husband closely, waiting for his reaction. "Well?" she prompted when he remained silent. "What do you think?" Daniel exhaled slowly, folding the letter and setting it aside. "It's flattering," he admitted, "but I don't think it's for me. I've got responsibilities. Here, this house, you, our life together. I'm happy where I am." Karoline nodded, though a part of her wondered if he was selling himself short. Still, she respected his decision. Daniel wasn't the kind of person to chase fame or fortune. He valued simplicity and stability far more than accolades, and truthfully, she loved him all the more for it. That night, as they sat together watching TV, Karoline rested her head on Daniel's shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "you may not see yourself as anything special, but you are to me. Always have been, always will be." Daniel smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "And you're the reason I keep trying to be better," he replied, "even when I don't feel like I'm enough." They sat in comfortable silence, the warmth of their bond stronger than ever. Outside, leaves rustled in the breeze, and the faint glow of streetlights illuminated their quiet neighborhood. Life had thrown its challenges their way, but together, they had faced them head-on and come out stronger on the other side. For Daniel and Karoline Leavitt, that was all that mattered. The weeks that followed the trial brought a sense of calm to Daniel and Karoline's life, but it also marked the beginning of subtle changes in their small town. People who had once overlooked Daniel now greeted him with respect. Neighbors stopped by not just for advice but also to share stories or ask for recommendations on books about law. Some even joked that he should run for mayor, though Daniel would laugh it off and say he was happy just fixing things around the house. Despite turning down the scholarship offer from the prestigious law school, Daniel couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity about what might have been. He didn't regret his decision. His heart was rooted in his quiet life, but the idea of learning more about the law lingered in the back of his mind. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen, table flipping through an old legal textbook he'd borrowed from the library, Karoline walked in carrying 2 mugs of hot tea. "What are you reading?" she asked, placing one mug in front of him. Daniel glanced up, smiling sheepishly. "Just brushing up on some stuff," he said, closing the book. "It's interesting, you know. There's so much I don't know yet." Karoline raised an eyebrow, amused. "You're telling me you don't know something? That's hard to believe after everything you've done." He chuckled, taking a sip of tea. "There's always more to learn. Maybe I'll take a class or 2 someday, just for fun." The thought of Daniel expanding his knowledge excited Karoline. She loved seeing this side of him, the curious, driven man who wasn't afraid to step out of his comfort zone. Still, she knew he wouldn't rush into anything. Daniel moved at his own pace, careful and deliberate, like the way he fixed things in his garage. Meanwhile, word of Daniel's courtroom success continued to spread beyond their immediate community. A local radio host invited him to appear on a morning talk show to discuss his experience. At first, Daniel declined, uncomfortable with the idea of being in the spotlight again. But Karoline encouraged him, reminding him that sharing his story could inspire others. "People need to hear this," she said one night as they sat on the couch. "Not everyone has the chance to see someone like you, a regular person, stand up and fight for what's right. Imagine how many people might feel braver because of your example." Reluctantly, Daniel agreed. The morning of the interview, he dressed in his best suit, which still bore the faint creases from its last wear during the trial. Karoline straightened his tie and kissed his cheek before sending him off with a reassuring smile. When Daniel arrived at the studio, he was surprised by how welcoming everyone was. The host, a cheerful woman named Linda, greeted him warmly and made small talk to ease his nerves. When the microphone light turned red, signaling the start of the broadcast, Daniel took a deep breath and began recounting his journey. "I never planned to be in court," he admitted, his voice steady despite the audience tuning in across the region. I'm just a guy who wanted to protect his home. But when push came to shove, I realized I had to step up. So I did my research, trusted the facts, and hoped for the best. Linda nodded thoughtfully. And look where that got you. You proved that anyone can stand up for themselves if they're willing to put in the work. What advice would you give to listeners who might find themselves in a similar situation? Daniel paused, thinking carefully before answering. Don't let fear stop you from doing what's right. It's okay to feel unsure or overwhelmed. You're not supposed to have all the answers. But don't give up. Ask questions, seek help, and trust yourself. Sometimes, the hardest battles bring out the best in us. The response to the interview was overwhelming. Listeners called in to thank Daniel for his honesty and encouragement. Letters poured into the station, many from people who said his words had inspired them to tackle their own challenges. For days afterward, strangers approached Daniel in stores or at the gas station to express their gratitude. As winter settled over the town, blanketing rooftops and trees with snow, Daniel found himself reflecting on the past year. He had started out simply trying to resolve a property dispute, but somehow his actions had sparked something bigger, a reminder that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. One chilly Saturday afternoon, while shoveling the driveway, Daniel noticed Mr. Peterson struggling to clear his own walkway. Without hesitation, he grabbed an extra shovel from the garage and headed over. Mr. Peterson looked startled but grateful as Daniel began helping him. You didn't have to do this, Mr. Peterson said gruffly, leaning on his shovel to catch his breath. It's no trouble, Daniel replied with a shrug. We've all got each other's back sometimes. The comment hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Though their relationship would never be close, there was a newfound mutual respect between them. By the time they finished clearing the snow, they exchanged a brief nod before parting ways. That evening, as Daniel warmed up by the fireplace, Karoline joined him with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. You're too good for this world, you know that? She teased, snuggling close. He laughed softly, pulling her closer. Nah, I'm just trying to do my part. Besides, we're lucky. Not everyone gets a second chance to make things right. Karoline smiled, resting her head against his chest. And not everyone makes the most of it like you do. Spring arrived sooner than expected, bringing with it the promise of renewal. Daniel spent his weekends tending to the garden, planting flowers, and vegetables that would bloom in the coming months. Karoline often joined him, humming softly as they worked side by side. Their lives were simple, predictable even, but filled with moments of quiet joy. One sunny afternoon, as Daniel tinkered with an old bicycle in the garage, a knock sounded at the door. When Karoline answered, she found Judge Harold Grayson standing on the porch, looking somewhat out of place in his casual attire. Good afternoon, the judge said, tipping his hat politely. Is Daniel available? Puzzled but polite, Karoline invited him inside and went to fetch Daniel. When the two men met in the living room, an awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Judge Grayson cleared his throat. I won't take up much of your time, he began. I just wanted to personally apologize for underestimating you during our last encounter. I pride myself on fairness, but I must admit, I allowed appearances to cloud my judgment. You taught me a valuable lesson that day, and I haven't forgotten. Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected visit. Thank you, Your Honor, he said after a moment. But honestly, there's no need to apologize. Everyone makes mistakes, including me. The judge smiled faintly, nodding. Still, I appreciate your grace. If there's ever anything I can do for you, don't hesitate to reach out. After the judge left, Karoline turned to Daniel, her eyes wide with disbelief. Did that really just happen? Daniel shrugged, laughing quietly. Guess even judges are human after all. As the seasons changed and years passed, Daniel's story became a cherished memory in the town's history. While he never pursued a career in law, he remained a trusted figure, someone people turned to for guidance and support. His legacy wasn't built on grand achievements or public recognition. It was rooted in the quiet ways he made a difference in the lives of those around him. For Karoline, watching her husband grow into the person he was today filled her with immense pride. She often reminded him that heroes didn't always wear capes. They wore scuffed shoes and carried toolboxes, ready to fix whatever needed fixing. And in her eyes, Daniel would always be the greatest hero of all. Time moved steadily forward, and the Leavitt household settled into a rhythm that felt familiar yet enriched by all they had been through. Daniel continued to tinker in his garage, repairing broken appliances for neighbors and occasionally helping them navigate tricky legal matters. Karoline often teased him about how he had become the unofficial fix-it man of their small town, not just for things that needed mending, but also for problems people couldn't solve on their own. One crisp spring morning, as Daniel sipped coffee on the porch, he noticed Mrs. Harper walking up the driveway with a basket of freshly baked muffins. She smiled warmly as she approached, her steps slow but steady despite her age. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said, setting the basket down on the table. "I just wanted to thank you again for everything you did last year. Those muffins are my way of saying I'll never forget it." Daniel chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble, Mrs. Harper. Helping you was the least I could do." She waved him off, her expression serious now. "Nonsense. You gave me peace of mind when I thought I'd lose my home. That's worth more than a few muffins." Her gaze softened, and she added, "You know, Daniel, there aren't many people like you left in this world. Folks who take time to help others without expecting anything in return." Before Daniel could respond, Karoline stepped outside, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper. What brings you here today?" "Just dropping off a little something for your wonderful husband," Mrs. Harper replied, patting Daniel lightly on the arm. "He deserves every bit of gratitude we can give him." Karoline grinned, looking at Daniel with affection. "See? Even Mrs. Harper knows what a gem you are." Mrs. Harper stayed for a while longer, chatting about the upcoming community fair and inviting the Leavitts to attend. As she walked away, Daniel turned to Karoline with a wry smile. "Sometimes I think people expect too much from me." Karoline laughed, nudging him playfully. "Or maybe they finally see what I've known all along. You're amazing." The community fair arrived sooner than expected, filling the park with colorful tents, laughter, and the smell of grilled food. Families gathered around booths selling handmade crafts while children ran between games and rides. The Leavitts strolled through the crowd, enjoying the lively atmosphere. Daniel carried a plate of barbecue ribs, while Karoline held a cup of lemonade, both marveling at how connected everyone seemed. As they passed by one of the booths, a voice called out, "Hey, Daniel, over here." It was Mr. Peterson, standing behind a table stacked with jars of homemade jam. He waved awkwardly, clearly unsure if Daniel would want to stop. To his surprise, Daniel walked over, setting his plate down as he greeted him. "Nice setup you've got here," Daniel said, glancing at the neatly arranged jars. "What kind is this?" he asked, pointing to a jar labeled Blackberry Bliss. Mr. Peterson relaxed slightly, nodding toward the label. "That one's my wife's favorite. She makes it every summer with berries from our garden." Karoline joined them, smiling politely. "It looks delicious. Maybe we'll take a jar home." The conversation flowed easily after that, touching on gardening tips and weather patterns. For the first time since the trial, their interaction felt genuinely friendly rather than forced. When they finally parted ways, Daniel shook Mr. Peterson's hand firmly, promising to try some of the jam soon. Later, as they sat together under a shady tree eating funnel cakes, Karoline leaned against Daniel, watching the festivities unfold. "You know," she said softly, "it's nice to see how far things have come. Even Mr. Peterson seems different now." Daniel nodded, brushing powdered sugar off his fingers. People change when they realize there's no reason to hold on to anger anymore. It's easier to move forward together than stay stuck in the past. Back at home, life continued its gentle pace. Daniel spent his evenings reading books about law and history, his curiosity growing with each passing day. Though he hadn't pursued formal education, he found joy in learning for its own sake. Karoline encouraged him, often bringing home new titles from the library or leaving articles clipped from newspapers on the kitchen counter. One evening, as Daniel flipped through a thick volume on property rights, Karoline walked in carrying 2 bowls of ice cream. "Still studying?" she asked, handing him a bowl. He grinned, closing the book. "Just trying to keep my brain sharp. Who knows when I might need this information again?" Karoline laughed, sitting beside him. "You're unstoppable, you know that?" They ate in comfortable silence, the soft hum of crickets drifting in through the open window. After finishing his ice cream, Daniel looked at Karoline thoughtfully. "Do you ever wonder what life would be like if none of this had happened? If we hadn't gone to court?" She tilted her head, considering his question. "I suppose it would be quieter. But I think we'd still be happy. We've always had each other, and that's what matters most." Daniel nodded, reaching for her hand. "You're right. Still, I'm glad it turned out the way it did. It taught us both a lot, about ourselves and about the people around us." Summer rolled in, bringing long days filled with sunshine and warmth. The Leavitts hosted a small gathering in their backyard, inviting close friends and neighbors to celebrate the season. Laughter echoed across the yard as guests enjoyed grilled burgers, cold drinks, and lively conversations. Children chased fireflies as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. During a lull in the festivities, Judge Grayson appeared at the edge of the yard, holding a bottle of wine. He raised a hand in greeting, looking slightly hesitant. Daniel spotted him immediately and waved him over. "Welcome," Daniel said, shaking the judge's hand. "Glad you could make it." Judge Grayson smiled, handing over the wine. "Thank you for having me. I wasn't sure if I should come, but I figured it was time to repay your kindness." The 2 men exchanged a knowing glance, their shared history unspoken, yet understood. As the night wore on, the judge mingled with the other, guests sharing stories and laughter. By the end of the evening, he seemed more relaxed than anyone had ever seen him. As the party wound down, Karoline stood beside Daniel, watching the last of their guests leave. "You know," she said, wrapping her arms around him, "I think tonight says a lot about who you are. People feel safe with you, they trust you." Daniel kissed the top of her head, pulling her closer. "It's not just me, it's us. Together we've built something special, a life where people know they belong." Autumn returned, bringing cooler temperatures and vibrant colors to the trees. Daniel spent his mornings raking leaves and his afternoons working on projects in the garage. One day, as he hammered away at a birdhouse he was building, Karoline poked her head in, holding a letter. "You've got mail," she announced, handing it to him. Curious, Daniel set aside his tools and opened the envelope. Inside was an invitation to speak at a local school's career day. The principal had heard about his courtroom victory and thought students might benefit from hearing his story. "What does it say?" Karoline asked, leaning over his shoulder. "They want me to talk to kids about standing up for yourself and believing in your abilities," Daniel replied, raising an eyebrow. "Think I'm cut out for public speaking?" Karoline laughed, squeezing his arm. "Absolutely. Besides, you've already inspired so many adults. Imagine what you could do for kids." After some deliberation, Daniel accepted the invitation. On the day of the event, he stood nervously in front of a classroom full of eager faces, clutching note cards in his hands. As he began speaking, his nerves melted away, replaced by a sense of purpose. "I'm not a lawyer or a politician," he told the students. "I'm just a regular guy who learned that sometimes doing the right thing means stepping outside your comfort zone. Don't be afraid to ask questions, work hard, and trust yourself. You're capable of more than you think." When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Students lined up afterward to ask questions, their eyes shining with admiration. For Daniel, it was a reminder that even the smallest actions could leave a lasting impact. As winter approached once more, the Leavitts prepared for the holidays, decorating their home with twinkling lights and festive wreaths. Life had changed in subtle but meaningful ways since the trial, yet its core remained the same, a quiet, loving partnership built on trust and resilience. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside, Daniel and Karoline sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot cocoa. Their reflections on the past year were filled with gratitude for each other, for their community, and for the lessons they had learned. "You've done so much good this year," Karoline murmured, resting her head on Daniel's shoulder. He smiled, kissing her temple. "We've done it together, and that's what makes it worthwhile." Outside, the world sparkled under a blanket of snow, peaceful and serene. Inside, the warmth of love and connection filled the air, a testament to the strength of two ordinary people who had chosen to live extraordinary lives. The new year began with a quiet optimism for Daniel and Karoline Leavitt. The holiday decorations were packed away, and the house returned to its usual tidy state. Yet, there was an undeniable sense of renewal in the air, a feeling that life had been enriched by all they had experienced together. For Daniel, the past months had taught him not only about the law but also about himself. He realized he didn't need grand gestures or titles to make a difference. Sometimes it was the small acts of kindness and determination that mattered most. One chilly January morning, as Daniel sipped his coffee at the kitchen table, he noticed a flyer tucked under the refrigerator magnet. It was an announcement for a community workshop on understanding your rights, hosted by the local library. The event aimed to educate residents about property laws, tenant rights, and other legal basics. At the bottom of the flyer, in bold letters, it read, "Special guest speaker, Daniel Leavitt." Karoline walked in just as Daniel was staring at the flyer, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Did you know about this?" he asked, holding it up for her to see. She grinned, leaning against the counter. "Maybe. The librarian called last week asking if you'd be interested. I told her you'd say yes." Daniel shook his head, laughing softly. "You're impossible, you know that." "Well, are you going to do it?" Karoline pressed, crossing her arms playfully. "Think of all the people who could benefit from hearing what you have to say." After a moment's hesitation, Daniel nodded. "All right, I'll do it, but only because you tricked me into it." The day of the workshop arrived, and the library's meeting room was packed with curious attendees, neighbors, friends, and even a few strangers from neighboring towns. Daniel stood at the front of the room, adjusting the microphone nervously as he scanned the crowd. Karoline sat near the back, giving him an encouraging thumbs up. "Good afternoon, everyone," Daniel began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I'm not a lawyer, and I don't pretend to be one. But I've learned a lot over the past year about how important it is to understand your rights and how to stand up for them when it matters." He went on to share his story, explaining how he had researched property laws and prepared for the trial. He spoke plainly, using simple language so everyone could follow along. When he mentioned specific examples like reviewing old deeds or cross-referencing maps, several people took notes, nodding thoughtfully. Toward the end of the session, Daniel opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up immediately, eager participants, asking about everything from rental agreements to boundary disputes. Daniel answered patiently, offering practical advice and reminding them to seek professional help if needed. As the workshop concluded, a line formed outside the door, with attendees waiting to thank Daniel personally. One young woman, clutching a notebook filled with scribbled notes, approached him hesitantly. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been dealing with a landlord who keeps raising my rent unfairly, and I didn't know where to start. Hearing you talk today gave me hope." Daniel smiled warmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. Today reminded Daniel that his journey wasn't just about winning a case, it was about empowering others to take control of their lives. With spring came another unexpected opportunity. A local nonprofit organization reached out to Daniel, inviting him to join their advisory board. They focused on helping low-income families navigate legal challenges, such as eviction notices and debt collection lawsuits. Though flattered, Daniel initially hesitated, unsure if he had the expertise to contribute meaningfully. "You don't have to be a lawyer to help," Karoline reminded him one evening as they discussed the offer. "You bring something different to the table, real-life experience. That's just as valuable." Her words struck a chord, and Daniel accepted the invitation. Over the next few months, he attended meetings, reviewed cases, and offered guidance based on his own research and insights. It was rewarding work, knowing he was making a difference in ways he hadn't imagined before. Summer brought warmth and activity to the town, and the Leavitts found themselves busier than ever. Daniel continued his volunteer work, while Karoline joined a gardening club, planting flowers in public spaces to brighten the community. Together, they balanced their individual passions with shared moments of joy, picnics in the park, evenings stargazing on the porch, and lazy Sundays spent reading side by side. One sunny afternoon, as Daniel worked in the garage repairing a neighbor's lawnmower, Judge Grayson stopped by unexpectedly. This time, he wore a casual shirt and jeans, looking more relaxed than Daniel had ever seen him. "Mind if I interrupt?" the judge asked, leaning against the doorway. "Not at all," Daniel replied, wiping grease-stained hands on a rag. "What brings you here?" Judge Grayson stepped inside, glancing around at the tools neatly organized on the walls. "I heard about the workshop and the non-profit work you're doing. I wanted to commend you. Not many people would take on such responsibilities without expecting anything in return." Daniel shrugged modestly. "It's just something I enjoy doing. If I can help even one person, it's worth it." The judge nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You remind me why I became a judge in the first place, to serve justice and make a difference. Sometimes we lose sight of that, but you embody it." They talked for a while longer, sharing stories and laughter. By the time Judge Grayson left, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. Even someone as authoritative as the judge saw value in his efforts, and that meant more than any title or accolade ever could. Autumn painted the town in shades of gold and crimson, signaling another year of growth and change. The Leavitts celebrated their anniversary quietly, exchanging heartfelt gifts and reminiscing about the ups and downs they had faced together. As they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Karoline turned to Daniel with a soft smile. "You've done so much good this year," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "Do you realize how many lives you've touched?" Daniel chuckled, wrapping an arm around her. "I think you're giving me too much credit. Most of it was just luck or maybe stubbornness." Karoline shook her head, her tone serious now. "No, it's more than that. You inspire people, Daniel. Not because you're perfect, but because you show them that anyone can rise to the occasion, when it counts." Her words lingered in the crisp evening air, filling Daniel with a quiet pride. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't wear a cape or save lives in dramatic ways. But he had proven that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things through hard work, compassion, and resilience. Winter returned, bringing snowflakes that danced in the wind and blanketed the world in white. The Leavitt home glowed with warmth, lit by twinkling lights and the scent of gingerbread baking in the oven. As Daniel and Karoline sat by the fire, reflecting on the year behind them, they felt a deep gratitude for the life they had built. "You know," Daniel said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I used to think success meant having a fancy job or being recognized for something big. But now I realize it's simpler than that. It's about the connections we make and the love we share." Karoline nodded, reaching for his hand. "And the impact we leave behind. Whether it's helping a neighbor or inspiring a stranger, every little bit counts." Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the world beyond their cozy home. Inside, the crackle of the fire and the warmth of their bond created a sanctuary, a reminder that true success wasn't measured by applause or awards, but by the quiet brilliance of living a meaningful life. For Daniel and Karoline Leavitt, that was enough.